F. William Engdahl. I'm an author, a researcher of geopolitics. My background is in economics, but I've spent about 39 years of my life researching the connection between economics and realpolitik, as Henry Kissinger would call it, power politics, and how that actually shapes the geography of conflict in the world in the last 100 years or so. The interesting thing about Gülen, he was, in his early years, involved in extreme right-wing Turkish networks that often had connections with NATO and Gladio secret operations. But what's interesting about him is when he made those remarks that led him to flee Turkey for fear of his life or fear of imprisonment in the late 1990s, he was brought into the United States and given extraordinary green card residence status through the intervention of three people: former ambassador to Turkey, Morton Abramovich, George Fidas, who has connections, or had connections, if he's still living, with the CIA, and an extremely critical person, Graham E. Fuller, who was a 25 years long CIA deputy director when he retired and went to the Rand Corporation. Graham E. Fuller is one of the critical architects of the CIA's use of Islamic fundamentalism, of the jihad ideology, and so forth, as a political weapon of the CIA and of the Pentagon to create chaos around the world against opponents of their policies. He would not have gotten his green card had not these CIA people, or CIA-connected people, intervene on his behalf. The U.S. State Department, interestingly enough, their lawyers argued in the court that gave him the green card, that gave Gülen the green card. They argued against giving Gülen a green card, saying, number one, he's no Islamic scholar, and number two, his movement has a very strange history, and this is not something we want to admit to the United States. The CIA faction intervened and won out, and even though the Erdogan government has, several years ago, has said all the charges against Gülen will be dropped if he wants to come back to Turkey, I think today that would not be the case, but that's something else. That despite that, Gülen remains in Saylorsburg, Pennsylvania, in a very palatial retreat outside of the reach of people in Turkey. So why does he run his worldwide empire from Saylorsburg, Pennsylvania, still to this day? The other thing is there have been documented cases, Russian intelligence documented after the collapse excuse me, of the Soviet Union, that the schools that Gülen rapidly established throughout former Soviet Union Muslim populations in Central Asia, in the Caucasus and so forth, that these schools taught English, and the English teachers were CIA agents. There were something like 500 CIA agents with a cover as English teachers infiltrated throughout Central Asia through the Gülen school networks. So all the evidence points to the fact that Fethullah Gülen is essentially an asset of the CIA that's being used, number one, to create a coup d'etat inside the institutions of the nation of Turkey, and number two, to use ethnic Turkish populations going right into China, actually, East Turkmenistan, they call it, to create destabilization across Eurasia. I think Gülen's role began to become clear on the collapse of the Soviet Union. Some people in the CIA, especially people around Graham Fuller and that faction, had the idea, I don't think it was a very clever idea, that they could use the ethnicity of Turkic origin peoples going right into China, into Xinjiang province, Uyghur people, who are originally a Turkic people, and create this Gülen ideology, and under the cover of creating these religious education centers to train elites in these very poor former Soviet republics, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, they tried, Turkmenistan, of course, and Kyrgyzstan and so forth, where there were large, historically large Muslim populations. They established their schools, they targeted the elites in those countries, and they said, we will give you the best education, we will bring your children to Turkey, to our universities, and make them into leading intellects. The Gülen movement, immediately after the spread into Central Asia, began to target Xinjiang province in China. And Xinjiang province is the westernmost province bordering Tibet province. And there the Gülen movement began working among the Uyghur people, an ethnic group that are historically Turkic people. And what they would do is, when they were still below the Chinese intelligence radar, they would recruit young Uyghur students who would be quite normal students and bring them to Turkey into special Gülen schools, universities, and so forth. And in documented cases, they would come out of this education process as fanatical jihadists ready to die for Allah. And then they would be sent to places like Syria to do battle with Al-Qaeda type jihadist organizations.